Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Senator Stewart's out there. Senator Hashmi and I are here, so we do have a quorum. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Education Subcommittee. Today we have two presentations related to population trends. Our first speaker is Hamilton Lombard with the UVA Weldon Cooper Center. Hamilton will present on changes in our K-12 enrollments. Our second speaker is Evan Price, a former Virginia Management Fellow with the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. Evan will talk about migration and the population of post-secondary graduates. But before we get started, I'll ask Wendy on our staff to make a few additional comments about this topic and our presenters. Wendy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This topic is something that is of interest both in the K-12 and the higher education population regarding our trends, knowing that we have some changes that are occurring. So we've invited one to really focus on the K-12 and then to look at what happens with graduates after. We do want to recognize that Evan Price was a management fellow with us, and we have spent a lot of time this summer looking into the topic of graduates later. So appreciate his service as a management fellow to us, and we welcome him back. So, but with that, we'll invite Hamilton first to come up and speak. Thank you.
Over the last few years, we've seen a pretty historic decline in enrollment in Virginia's public schools, a lot of that driven by families moving their children to private school, to homeschools. And for the remainder of the decade, my office is expecting public school enrollment in Virginia to steadily decline, possibly going into the 2030s. Within a few years, we're also expecting the number of high school graduates in Virginia to start to decline. That's going to have an impact on our colleges and workforce. I would imagine in this session, some of these trends have already come up a bit. I'm hoping in the next 20 or so minutes that I have to examine these trends in a bit more depth, to provide some updates based off of data my office has released just in the last few weeks, and hopefully answer any questions you have in the detail you require. When you look at demographic trends in Virginia over the last couple of decades, it's hard to describe them without using a word like uneven or disparity. We've had very different economic trends depending where you are in Virginia. And that's led to very different income trends, very different age trends, very different population change trends as well. And I think you see this really when you look at public school enrollment during the last decade here in Virginia. It's quite uneven. We had widespread decline in enrollment in the smaller school divisions, most of them rural in the South and West. But at the same time, we had strong enrollment growth in many of our bigger school divisions, particularly up in Northern Virginia. So when you zoomed out a bit and just looked at Virginia's numbers as a whole, what you saw was steady growth in school enrollment going through the 2010s, really a continuation of something we've seen going on since the 1980s, where year over year we had more students in Virginia's public schools than we did the year before. But in 2018, we saw Virginia's public school enrollment decline. That was the first time we'd seen that since 1984. Even though enrollment bounced back the next year, and we expect it to continue growing for a couple more years, during the 2010s, there were a number of indicators that started lighting up, showing that this long run in growth in Virginia's public schools was coming to an end soon. One of the first indicators was in 2013, we saw kindergarten class sizes shrinking. The next year, they were still smaller. So by 2015, we saw elementary school enrollment in Virginia decline. Without the pandemic, we're expecting middle school enrollment to decline around 2020. And then within a few years, without the pandemic, we already were expecting Virginia's public schools to start declining. And over the 2020s, we expected enrollment to fall by about 50,000 students by the end of the decade. And this trend seemed to be on course to continue really for the foreseeable future, past 2030 even. If you think about that long turnaround time from shrinking kindergarten classes to total enrollment declining, we would expect a similar lag time between seeing indicators that enrollment is going to start growing again and actually growing. So far, there are no indicators that we're going to see this trend of enrollment decline stop. There are two main reasons why we thought back before the pandemic that Virginia's public schools would start declining. One is births. Births have been declining here in Virginia now for going on close to 2 decades. Most years we have fewer births than the year before. There is a strong correlation between births and public school enrollment. This chart shows us births, then kindergarten enrollment 5 years later. Births went up, kindergarten enrollment went up, births are going down, now we're seeing kindergarten enrollment go down. One other point to note, though, looking at this chart is that gap between kindergarten enrollment and births. those are children being educated privately for kindergarten. And if you look over the chart from left to right, you can see that gap is getting larger. More children are being educated privately for kindergarten. That's a trend I'm going to look at a little bit more in a few slides. Nationally, we saw a decline in births just like in Virginia. We've very similar trend, but one difference we had in Virginia that I think Evan's going to expand on a bit more has been this outmigration we've seen over the last decade. There are a lot of different reasons for that. I'm not going to go into it, but thinking about this in relation to public school enrollment, there have been many families leaving Virginia, and they've been disproportionately from a few school divisions in Northern Virginia. So this is affecting enrollment for Virginia as a whole, but really a couple of divisions just up in Northern Virginia, particularly Fairfax, Arlington, and some of the other ones around there. You put these two trends together, though, the outmigration and, I think more importantly, the decline in births. That's why, before anybody heard of COVID-19, we expected enrollment here in Virginia to start declining. But then we did have the pandemic. We saw tens of thousands of students leave Virginia's public schools the first year, more leave the next year. We had a bit of a bounce back in 2022, but now when you look at this past fall, we're starting to decline as we would have expected based off of these pre-pandemic trends. One big question that's been around now for a while, really since 2020, was how many of these tens of thousands of students who left might return. Initially, I think the best answer would have been we could expect most to once we go back to in-person, parents feel comfortable sending their kids to school or doing virtual. But when you look at the numbers for this past fall, we only saw several thousand students who are missing from Virginia's public schools, several hundred of the 40,000 plus eventually return. So we're down to the point where there's almost no return to public school. It's been pretty much stable, about 40,000 fewer children in Virginia's public schools now for 4 years. One thing I think worth looking at with this is where those students are missing. This is the difference between the number of students we've expected to have in Virginia's public schools last fall and the number we did have. Third grade is the largest missing grade. Those have been kindergartners the fall of 2020. Their parents educated them privately for that fall. They've educated them privately every fall since. I think it's a fair assumption to say that most of those children will continue to be educated privately. There's been almost no return. But thinking a little longer term, I think the most telling statistic here is a kindergarten and first grade. This past fall, which is the 5th school year since the pandemic began, we had thousands of parents opt to educate their children privately for kindergarten and first grade. That points towards the idea, I think, that we've seen a permanent increase in the share of children in Virginia who are being educated privately. There's a description I've seen people use of the pandemic that it seemed to accelerate different trends we already saw in place. I think when you look at private school enrollment in Virginia, homeschool enrollment, that's very much the case. Both were growing faster than public school enrollment before the pandemic, but during the pandemic we saw a decade or worth of growth concentrated just within a few years. We've seen some parents that were homeschooling their children in 2020 opt to go back to public school, but the vast majority have stuck with it. And the numbers we have for 2023 for private school points towards the fact that it continued to grow this past fall, even though we saw public school enrollment decline. Getting good data on private school, homeschool enrollment in Virginia is a bit difficult. There's no central database on it, but the Census Bureau conducts the largest annual survey done in the country, the American Community Survey, and they do collect some of this data. And we can see pre-COVID and post-COVID private school enrollment in Virginia, homeschool enrollment, private education, I should say, between 2019 and 2022 using these slightly unusual geographies the census prefers. There's a lot of things going on, but I think the main takeaway is we've seen an across-the-board increase in private education, no matter where you are in Virginia. We're up to the point now where about 1 in 8, a little over that, school children are being educated privately. That's up quite a bit from before the pandemic. But there are some areas like here in Richmond, the western side of Richmond, the suburbs of Roanoke, and Fairfax, where the shares are much higher. It could be 1 in 4, 1 in 5 children now are being educated privately. Before the pandemic, it was closer to 1 in 10. So it's a significant increase. There are a lot of different reasons, I think, why we've seen private education grow. Some of those are well outside of my area of expertise, but one point I would make from an economic demographic perspective is that it's not often pointed out that a disproportionate share of the income gains we've seen here in Virginia and around the country have been concentrated among families with children. There's been a message for a long time to graduate high school, get job skills, get established in your career, then have children. And when you look at the data here in Virginia around the country, that message has really taken to heart by millennials and I think increasingly Gen Z. One statistic that jumped out to me is that if you go back 20 years ago, we had about the same number of Virginians between 25 and 50 with a high school degree as a college degree. Now we're closer to twice as many with a college degree as a high school degree. With that extra education. I think you've seen a boost in income for the people in that age group, but I think also more interest in their own children's education, whether that's customizing it, going the private route, or being willing and able to pay to live in the attendance zone of a school with a higher reputation. I think we're seeing both of those at work. And that's part, I think, of why we've seen this steady increase in private education. But a side effect of all that has been with the focus on getting established in your career, then having children, is we've seen a significant decline in the number of births among younger women. Again, most people would say that's a good thing, but the net effect has been we have fewer births and they're not getting made up. So one of the earlier charts I showed where we saw that steady decline in births in Virginia, that was in large part driven by a decline in teen births. More recently, we're seeing women in their 20s and 30s having fewer children. If we look at the decline in births in Virginia on the regional level, we can see actually the trends are a lot more mixed. Initially, we had a much sharper decline in these rural areas, Hampton Roads. Those areas had more teen pregnancies. That's why during the 2010s we had so much enrollment decline in those areas, births decline there first. But thinking about this decade and where we're going, it's really telling looking at Northern Virginia how strong its birth trends were and its enrollment trends were until about the mid-2010s. Since then, we've seen a sharper decline in births there than we saw in the coal fields in Virginia. Arlington saw the number of births go down by close to a quarter just since 2015. And that's really starting to affect public schools in that area. In my office, it's been really noticeable having conversations with school officials in Northern Virginia how just a few years ago it was about whether they should add capacity. Now it's whether they should be getting rid of capacity just because of how quickly some of these demographic trends have changed. 2 weeks ago, my office released school enrollment projections going out to 2028 for every division in Virginia. And when you look at what we're expecting over the next 5 years for public school enrollment, a lot of that is being driven by the birth trends. I think if you look at North Virginia, that's a marked change from the past where they had the strongest enrollment growth. Now we're expecting widespread enrollment decline. We're expecting some growth in some surprising areas. Bath and Highland are some of the small school divisions of Virginia. We're expecting them to be among the fastest growing ones going forward. They've lost about half their students over the last few decades. This is part of a trend we're seeing really around the country where since the pandemic, we've seen a lot more migration into rural areas. I think there's been a question about this among demographers. The same way in education, it's been how many of these students who left during the pandemic will return. It seems like they're not going to. We're not seeing signs of this pre-pandemic trend coming back. We're still seeing the numbers show more out-migration from urban areas. One last point to note when we're thinking about where school enrollment's going during this decade is during the last decade, it was very uneven. But if you look at the expected change in enrollment during this decade, we're expecting it to not be as disparate, to be much more even across the board. One way of showing that is if we look at the change in enrollment by division size. During the last decade, the larger the division was, the more likely they were to grow, the smaller, the sharper the decline. Going forward, we're expecting the largest school divisions in Virginia over the next 5 years to experience about the same decline as the smallest ones. So it should be a lot more even across the board and maybe will cause a little less stress that we saw when we had such different trends during the last decade. But we're still expecting enrollment to decline for Virginia as a whole. And that's going to start having implications well beyond our public schools. We're expecting in the next few years for the number of high school graduates in Virginia to start to decline. We had this long run of growth in the number of high school graduates. That's why we saw so much growth in universities around Virginia. The last decade or so, it's leveled off. We've seen some regional universities have enrollment declines because of that. But we're going to be going to a very different environment within a few years where the number of high school graduates starts to decline. And that's not just going to affect universities, it's also going to affect our workforce as well. If you look at our age distribution in Virginia, we're very similar to what you see with the high school graduates. We're about as many people turning 65 as 18, so we've been in a very even trend. It's been a tight labor market, but the labor force is steady. The next decade, we're expecting these smaller cohorts because of declining births to start entering the workforce. And we're likely going to be in a position where the workforce is shrinking. Because we have migration going to other states, we're probably going to rely more on immigration to fill some of those holes in the labor force as they develop from having a shrinking labor force. I went through a fair amount of slides there, but there really were three main points I was hoping to go over. One was this question I think has been the last couple of years about these students missing from Virginia's public schools. I think it's fairly safe to say the vast majority of those 40,000 are not coming back at this point. The other point that we're very much on track with this enrollment decline we expected before the pandemic. We're following right along with it. I would expect that to continue into 2030, possibly past that. And then this last point to think about, the number of high school graduates is fairly certain to decline just based off of they're already in school, we already know where they are. That's a pretty consistent one. But it is going to change, I think, a lot of discussions. We're going to be a very different environment within a few years. It's something we've seen coming for a long time, but we're just about there where the number of high school graduates is dropping and likely our workforce will start shrinking as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamilton. Are there any questions regarding this presentation? Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Our next speaker, Evan Price.
All right. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Evan Price, and this afternoon I'll be presenting to you all about migration and post-secondary graduate flight and their impacts on the Commonwealth. I will answer whether Virginia is experiencing a negative net migration, meaning if more people are moving away from Virginia than move into Virginia each year. And I will also look at post-secondary graduate flight, sometimes known as brain drain or human capital flight, and review if Virginia is keeping or losing its highly skilled and highly educated population. This presentation will provide a high-level overview of these two phenomena and review their significant impacts on the Commonwealth. Moving quickly along, here's what will be included in this presentation. First, I will cover why migration and post-secondary graduate flight are of concern to the Commonwealth. Then I will review the research on migration, as well as cover the financial implications of migration before covering the research on post-secondary graduate flight. I will then cover some policy considerations and future steps before concluding my presentation. So, why do these issues matter? First, Virginia's population is our workforce and fills the Commonwealth's jobs. Losing population, and particularly those with post-secondary skills or educations, weakens our workforce. That impact on the workforce has consequences for the Commonwealth's revenues, as a decline in earnings leads to a decline in state income tax revenues. And if the losses of working age adults are significant enough, Virginia's dependency ratio, the ratio of those benefiting from entitlement programs to those contributing to those programs, will grow. Moving on to what the research has found, data from two Census Bureau surveys both suggest that Virginia is likely losing more individuals each year than gaining, with a slight downward trend over the past decade. These data are, however, estimates with a margin of error, and true net migration could be positive or negative. The IRS also collects migration data from federal income tax filers. Their data suggests that Virginia has lost more people than has gained in recent years, though there is some fluctuation. IRS migration data do not have a margin of error, but they do, however, leave out people who, for whatever reason, did not file federal income taxes, which amounts to about 2 million people every year, 2 million Virginians every year. This outflow of tax filers has fiscal implications. IRS data also report adjusted gross income for movers, which reveals that Virginia has lost billions in cumulative individual adjusted gross income over the past decade, including a loss of $1.8 billion in adjusted gross income in 2021. Though Virginia's total AGI has still increased during the same time period, that growth is slowed down by net outflow of individual income. Of course, part of the general fund comes from the individual income tax, and the aforementioned loss of individual income has a negative impact on Virginia's income tax receipts. By taking the lost AGI reported by the IRS and estimating how much of that AGI would become Virginia's state income tax, estimate Virginia has lost approximately $670 million in cumulative individual income taxes since 2012. In 2021 alone, Virginia has lost an estimated $103 million in potential individual income tax receipts due to outmigration. Moving back to migration, senators, you all may have seen data from moving companies used to show Virginia's net migration rates. Both U-Haul and United Van Lines' data suggests that before 2022, more people were moving out of Virginia than in, so that negative migration. and then that trend switched in 2022, leading to net positive migration. While these data are good news, they are not on par with census studies or administrative data, nor are they definitive answers. U-Haul and United Van Lines only report on their customers, whereas data from the IRS and Census Bureau cover entire populations in their data. And a related but important note, even if Virginia sees more people leave each year than move in, Commonwealth is still growing, albeit slower than the national average. This growth is driven by births and immigration, but may be slowed by net outmigration. Before I move on to post-secondary graduate flight, Madam Chair, I'll pause here briefly if there are any questions so far.
Are there any questions on what has been presented thus far?
All right, moving right along.
Okay.
Moving on to the next topic, are Virginia's graduates of post-secondary education leaving Virginia? The research provides mixed answers, but there is reason to be concerned. The first source is provided by the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. By matching records of all graduates from Virginia institutions between 2008 and 2018 to addresses obtained by the company Alumni Finder, Chev found that of all individuals who graduated from a Virginia institution in that decade, a minimum of 57 graduates either lived or worked in Virginia. The number increases to 73% for in-state residents who graduated from a Virginia institution. And these data do include graduates from short-term credential programs all the way to doctoral programs. And while these data do suggest that Virginia keeps most of its graduate, a not insignificant 20% of graduates from Virginia's institutions were found to have moved away after graduation. The next source is from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. VEDP analyzed census data to determine the net migration of bachelor's degree holders from Virginia. The chart on the screen now shows their findings. You note that the estimated net migration of bachelor's degree holders in more recent years has fluctuated between positive and negative, and there is a margin of error. Unfortunately, that error means that in almost every year, the actual net migration of bachelor's degree holders could have been positive or negative. Because of the lack of an exact answer and with the estimated net migration fluctuating, there is room for concern. So Virginia may be experiencing net negative migration, and it may be experiencing post-secondary graduate flight. Despite the lack of a definitive answer, there are policy considerations that may be made to address these two issues. First, what incentivizes an individual to move? Research from the Census Bureau suggests that the top 3 reasons why people move are for housing, family, or employment reasons. While family reasons are likely out of the control of the Senate, addressing shortages in housing availability, affordability, or quality may reduce the number of people moving away from an area due to housing reasons, or encourage people to move to an area. Continued investment in jobs, particularly high-paying and stable jobs, further incentivizes individuals to move to or to remain in Virginia. As for immediate future steps, leveraging state entities to observe the data used today and continue to research these topics. Leverage state entities to observe the data. Chev, VEDP, or our friends at Weldon Cooper Center, not to give Mr. Lombard more work, can use their expertise or their own data to shed light on migration and post-secondary graduate flight and ensure that the Senate is up to date on these issues and has the most reliable information possible. Then, review policy actions that may impact where an individual decides to move. And finally, continue to invest in job growth as well as education and job training to ensure that Virginians have the education, skills, and jobs they need to succeed in Virginia. Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have or discuss anything in further detail.
Thank you. Evan, can you go back to slide 8?
Slide 8. U-Haul.
Okay. There you indicate that more people moved into Virginia than out. So what is the issue with the, we keep hearing about Virginia's losing population. Mm-hmm. So where's the disconnect as it relates to Virginia losing population, but this is saying that there are more people moving into the state than out?
Madam Chair, U-Haul and United Van Lines are a much different data set than the census or IRS, whereas the census, census and the American Community Survey, which the census conducts, is a study of the entire population. U-Haul and United Van Lines are just studies of their customers. Not that they have inaccurate information, but census information, IRS information is more representative of the larger population, whereas U-Haul and United Van Lines are just their customers, and people might be renting their vehicles for reasons other than moving to a different state.
Madam Chair, I may also add this data is for 2022, and the data that we have from IRS and census is also only till 2021. So it could be an early indicator, and we'll need to keep looking at that.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.